Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Siobhan Huggins is an independent researcher with interest in cholesterol metabolism, inflammation, and metabolic diseases. She first went on a ketogenic diet for weight loss in August of 2016 and found that it resulted in numerous physical and mental health benefits. After meeting former podcast guest Dave Feldman at KetoFest 2017, Siobhan's passion for lipidology was ignited, and she was driven to research all she could in an attempt to figure out how lipids were involved in the immune system and chronic diseases. After losing 80 pounds, she referred to a lipedema specialist for a possible diagnosis, which sparked her interest in the condition as a whole and the people it affects every day. She was finally diagnosed with lipedema in 2021, and she promptly joined the board of the Lipedema Project as a research specialist. She presents at various conferences on lipedema pathophysiology and the mechanisms of why ketogenic diets may be uniquely beneficial for managing lipedema symptoms and progression. She has since written several published articles on many platforms, including on Dave Feldman's Cholesterol Code website. Siobhan Huggins, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat and dive in.
It is such an honor to finally host you. This has been a very long time coming. It should have been long enough for me to get your introduction a little bit better. I really stumbled through that one. I apologize. I recall, and tell me if this is wrong. If I'm misremembering, let me know. But I think we first met in March of 2020 when you were at Low Carb Denver. I think you were at that conference, officially the weirdest conference ever, because it was in March of 2020. People can think back and remember, like, that was the weekend. Everything was shutting down. Denver was turning into a ghost town by the hour. It was really kind of strange. And I specifically remember you being at that conference, and you would stand up after every speaker and go right to the microphone and ask the most intelligent, amazing questions. So like Dr. Nadir Ali and all of these people I thought was absolutely wonderful. And I realized then, like, I've got a lot to learn. You were very smart back then, and you've only gotten much smarter since then.
You know, what's weird about that is I've gotten a fair amount of comments on my Q&A questions. Like, people have come up and been like, are you that person who keeps going up at the Q&A? I did the same thing at the Lipedema World Congress. It was very, like, I don't know what's different about the questions that I'm asking. I just have weird questions, I guess. But I find that interaction so fun. I try to be better about my Q&A questions because I can get like super researcher mode and it can come off kind of aggressive. But I just have fun with the science of it all and like exploring the different avenues and how things interconnect and all this stuff. It's so fun. And it's in such a good community too, where people are so like good spirited and good faith discussions. So I always try to take advantage of Q&A.
Well, you do a great job. My first reaction every time I hear one of your questions is usually something along the lines of, oh, I never thought about it like that. I always think it's really provocative. The way you phrase the question, it's always crystal clear, and it always shines light at a different angle than things I talked about. And you're right. This community is absolutely wonderful. Like, I think with anything else I've ever been interested in, I'd maybe go to a conference or two, and that would kind of be the end of it. But this one, I see you at so many of them because we both, if nothing else, just love to be around these people. Like, it's so cool to be at a place like Austin, where we just were, or Las Vegas at the COSI conference with Dave Feldman, to be around this group of people and just so hungry for knowledge and trying to gain wisdom in this area. Is just it just fuels that passion even more.
Yeah, and I will say that I have found another community within the lipedema research and patient advocacy and all that. It's very, very similar. So it did have a lot of that same tone at the Lipedema World Congress, where people didn't care if you disagreed. There were people getting into good-spirited, good faith arguments, like debating over this different stuff because they just wanted to find out what the answers were. It was so refreshing. And I feel like I wish I could see more of that in like every scientific circle, really just every discussion circle of like, okay, let's just like talk it out. Like, I want to understand your viewpoint. You want to understand my viewpoint. Let's figure out where we overlap, where the differences are, and then what we can look into. Because, I mean, one thing we discussed a lot during the Congress and the writing of our case definition article on lipedema that came out recently is the reason that people disagree is often because there's something we don't know enough about. So people are able to interpret it in different ways. And so those are the areas that we should focus more on and figure out, like, okay, what is going on here where so many people can have so many different viewpoints? Clearly, there's something we're not understanding. So it's really fun.
Yeah, I love that aspect of things. I wish I could have attended that. I know lipedema is such a frustrating and vexing problem for way more women than know that actually have it. I was surprised the first time we ever did content on lipedema, how much interest we generated and how much interest and
Hmm.
comments and comment after comment after comment on the YouTube video of people wanting more information. There's just not a lot out there. So it's so important. But you mentioned the ability to take people and put them in the same place and have a discussion. I mean, what about like at COSI? It was a great example. All the cardiologists that got on stage and had debates
Oh, I
back and
love
forth.
that. It was so awesome.
90 minutes. It was 90 minutes of going back and forth about statins and all these. It was phenomenal. I cannot get enough of that.
Yeah, that was my favorite panel discussion ever because throughout, like, it was someone cautiously optimistic, someone kind of in the middle, and then someone cautiously pessimistic, like, awesome, just width of views and like diversity of views. And then, like, throughout the entire thing, I was like, that's a good point, and that's a good point, and that's a good point too. Like, all of you are making great points, and it's like just such a great discussion. I talked to Dave after that. I was like, that was my favorite because often when I see like these debates of like vegan versus non-vegan, whatever it is, it's like I've gotten so burned out on it because it can devolve so fast if there's not good moderation, if people aren't well versed in debating sometimes, I think, and there's just so many things that can go wrong. So to see one that went perfect was like, it can be done. We should do more of these that are this quality, please.
It was so good. Dave did such a good job moderating that as well and keeping everybody on topic. I'll never forget. I've mentioned this recently, but Amy Berger at a similar panel that happened at Low Carb Denver 2023 with all the cardiologists was
Mm.
wonderful. Amy Berger was sitting next to me and she commented like all of those people should never be on the same stage at once. Like if something were to happen to the stage and we lost all these people all at once, like that would not be good. We need to keep all these people like separated.
Yeah, just stay in your corners.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think just like building that healthy discussion is so important because it's easy to like get into a viewpoint and get stuck there, and the only way to break people out is exposure to other ideas. So I'm all in favor of open debate and discussion as long as it's good faith and civil and polite. There's a lot that can be gained from that.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why I just love your work so much. You and Dave are, I think, a match made in heaven as far as like people who talk very scientifically about the things we know, the things we don't know. Your personal story was not necessarily like somebody told you to try keto and you just tried it without looking into it. Like you're always researching and getting obsessed with something. Every time I feel like I'm obsessed with this topic, I always remember like, no, Siobhan's a little bit more obsessed than I am, which is great. But let's.
Yeah.
I think it's a great thing, and it's a fascinating topic to get obsessed about. And there's so much there. And like I said, I really respect you and your work because you're never saying you're absolutely sure of something. We're always learning. But let's go back and talk about your own personal story and how you found some of this stuff to begin with.
Yeah, so going back like all the way to the beginning. So even before the beginning of the beginning, in terms of the obsessiveness, that's been there since I was a kid. I was obsessed with gymnastics for a long time because I saw this one thing. It was like in America's Got Talent type of thing where I saw someone doing like these contortionist gymnast type stuff. I was like, I want to do that. And so I got into gymnastics, obsessed over it for a very long time. But this actually intercedes with the rest of the story because around when I was 10 or 11, um, the depression symptoms I had been experiencing for a few years at that point really came into full force. And I dropped gymnastics. I also dropped swimming, which I also really liked at the time. Parents, just an FYI, if your if your kids suddenly drop a bunch of hobbies at once, maybe look into that and see if, like what's going on. But at the same time, I had started gaining weight, and it's really interesting because I have journal entries from when I was 9 years old, and I was already talking about being overweight, needing to go on a diet, blah, 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 lots of body image issues and self loathing, and a lot of depression wrapped into all of that. So that's about where my issues started, is around like 9 to 11 years old or so. And things didn't really get better for a long time. When I was 14, I went on a vegetarian diet. Didn't really do anything that I could tell. It was very frustrating trying to navigate, I would say, which is interesting looking at it now, because I'm on a restrictive diet, but I don't find it difficult to navigate at all. I don't think I've ever been to a restaurant where I couldn't eat anything, with two exceptions, but they're like fast food places and I don't eat there anyway. But yeah, so I struggled with weight. I kept gaining weight. By the time I was 18, I was 240 pounds, and I'm 5'2", so that's a lot on my frame. I struggled a lot with the depression. I had pretty bad mood swings as well, especially when I calorie restricted. It would make the depression symptoms and the mood swings even worse. And it's like I could lose a little bit of weight through calorie restriction. I did calorie restriction again about 2 years later, I think 1 or 2 years later, and I lost 20 pounds, but I felt not good. I felt like garbage. And it was like I couldn't maintain it. Like I would get so hungry that it just wasn't like, how am I supposed to maintain this for the rest of my life? It just did not make sense to me. So I could maintain it for a few months, and then it would just get to the point where it wasn't possible anymore. And at one point, I was going to go through that cycle again because I wanted to be thin and healthy. And a lot of it was vanity initially, especially because at that point I was early in, well, not early in actually, but I was earlier into my relationship with my now husband. I wanted to look as best as possible for him. Weight loss, I felt like, was part of that for me. And so I went in to my mom's office and I was like, I'm going to try calorie restriction again, kind of expecting a rah-rah, like, go for it. She was like, actually, instead of doing that, maybe you could look into this ketogenic diet thing. She had been looking into it already at that point. So she kind of handed me a magazine, said, here's an article on it. And I was like, an article in this magazine? This is like drivel. And she's like, it's just something I had on hand. Just read it and go away. And I was like, okay, fine. So I ended up looking into it, and it seemed like there actually was research on ketogenic diet, so it wasn't complete woo-woo. And so at that point, I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to try this, I need to actually try it. And so I decided to do 2 months of super strict keto, no cheating, like to the letter of the law, like 80% fat, like let's go, carbs below 20 grams, like full throttle, because if it wasn't going to work, I wanted to know right away. And the best way for me to figure that out was to like steel man the situation, to use like a Dave term. So it's like, I'm going to do this as best as I possibly can, and we're going to go into it. And I expected it to like not do anything. But by the end of the 2 months, I had lost 20 pounds, which, like I said, I have done previously. But the difference this time was I wasn't hungry. Like, it was just working. Like, okay, I eat these foods and then it just works. And the other thing that I noticed at that 2-month point was that I was standing in a parking lot and I had like this weird feeling. And what's cool is at this point, I've seen Ian Campbell talk about the same feeling of just like feeling something weird in this normal everyday place. And I realized it was that I didn't feel depressed. I was happy and content with my life. I was grateful for my family. I was grateful for my boyfriend. I was grateful for having a job that I could go to every day and have that level of security. Like, I was just content. And like, for reference, the last time I can remember feeling that before that point was when I was in kindergarten. So like, just completely like, okay, hold on. So if this is what this diet does, this is what I'm on for life, because I don't want to feel how I feel when I'm not on the diet ever again, ever. It's bad. I don't recommend it. So that was really the big why for me. Like, yes, I was losing weight and I was getting healthier and my joint pain went away and my chronic acne went away and my eczema went away and my hair got healthier and stopped being as frizzy and like all of this different stuff, had more energy, whatever. But the depression was like, even if everything else goes away, this is why I am sticking to this as long as this effect remains. And around that same point, I was talking to my now husband, and I was like, I feel like at some point, this is going to stop working in terms of weight loss, and I'm going to gain it all back. Like, I was worried that he would have seen me at a smaller size at that point, and then I'd regain it, and he'd be disappointed. And he was like, I loved you before. I thought you were beautiful before. I think you're beautiful now. But the important aspect to me is that you seem happier doing this. So again, like he was on the same wavelength, part of why we got married, of just like, if this is what it takes to make you happy, it doesn't matter what else happens, because the difference is just so stark. And you talked about Keto Fest in 2017. My mom was also there. We were both staff. Which was another funny thing, because I asked if she would go with me or take me there as a birthday present. And she said, well, like the cost of the tickets and the cost of the flight and all this stuff. And I was like, well, what if I pay for all of it? And she's like, then how is that a birthday present? And I totally suckered up to her to get her to come. And it's like, you being there would be the birthday present, Mom. She's like, okay, fine. So we both went. And so she got to see my behavior in that situation. And she was talking to one of the other staff members. And she said, like, it was like I was a different person. Like, on a ketogenic diet, I am a different person. I am more sociable. I'm more comfortable. I'm less anxious. I'm less depressed. Like, I just feel like, oh, is this what people experience? Like, is this normal? It's so strange. And then, like, Keto Fest in 2017 was the catalyst of so much different stuff, because I met Amber O'Hearn for the first time, and I eventually moved in with her and lived with her for a few years. We still live in the same town. And I met Dave for the first time, and Dave was he is such an interesting person. Like, he's so welcoming and cheerful and kind. And to me, that was just like, huh? It's so weird to me, of like, how can you be like, he was this Tigger of a person. And so partly for that, but then partly, like, at the time I worked in IT, and even as a child, I would grow up with these conversations with my dad, who's also in IT. And me and Dad would talk about like object-oriented programming and like all of this different stuff. And Dave was talking about that same stuff as well, but in terms of cholesterol metabolism. And cholesterol is not really anything I had thought of much. Like, I knew I had gotten into a tiff with a prior doctor because my cholesterol was super high before keto, and there was all this stuff. So that was about the only interaction I had ever had with cholesterol up to that point. My dad had early heart disease, so obviously we talked about it in that context too. But Dave was talking about it in a way that was really interesting to me, because he was using word and language that I understood from this like technical perspective. So the combination of his really strange to me, genuine personality, plus what he was talking about was really interesting, meant like every time there was an open seat next to him, I'd be sitting down. And my tactic, for one, I was genuinely interested in it, but for two, I knew if I ask him questions about cholesterol, he'll talk a lot, which made the whole interaction easier. So I would ask like, okay, so you mentioned blah, blah, blah about HDL, and I'd just start asking questions. And on the way back from Keto Fest, I had gotten his cell phone number and asked if I could text him, and he said sure. So I was already asking him, like, what's the best entry point to learning about cholesterol? And eventually I ended up reading through a couple different textbooks that were kind of sideways recommended through the resource that he had suggested. And from there, we just started talking and working together. And I wanted to help him because I could tell, even at that point, that he was really busy. And like now, he's even busier. But like the obsessive part of me has always been a strange aspect of myself that I've had to deal with because I would be introduced to topics and by other people, and then I would get like way more into them than the other person. And eventually I'd reach a point where I was talking about it like tea cultivars or something. And the person would just have like this blank expression and I've completely lost them. And it's like, okay, whatever. And then it wasn't as fun anymore. But the one time, I mean, it's happened now with lipedema stuff as well, but the first time that that ever happened where it went differently for me was with Dave, because I would send him these huge walls of text over Slack and just talking about like the papers I had been reading and my thoughts on them and asking him questions like, do you think it works like this way, blah, blah, blah. And for the first time in my life, someone responded just as excited and enthusiastic and interested as I was. And I was like, that's it. Like, this is it for me. This is what I'm doing. And like, man, we've been working together full time for since 2018. So what is that? 6 years now. And it's just been so fun. And if you want to talk about like civil, polite debates and discussions, Dave and I have gotten into plenty of them, and it's so fun and it's so great. And I feel like that initial aspect of looking into cholesterol metabolism and eventually the immune system and inflammation and insulin resistance and how all of those interconnect, which is a whole like super fascinating thing just in itself, really set me up really well for the lipedema diagnosis. And the lipedema diagnosis was a bit of a slow hitter. So I had lost a bunch of weight on a ketogenic diet. I had a normal waist size. I still do. But there was like this odd aspect to it where even with my first picture with Dave, where I still had a little bit more weight to lose, he had like put his arm around me for the picture. And I remember feeling so self-conscious because I was aware that my arms were just big, like they looked big. And like there's this sequence of pictures where I'm clearly like trying to pull away, like, nah, I don't know about it. And then he pulls me back in and it's great. But like I was aware on some level of the disproportion. I just thought it was how I was naturally shaped. But fast forward to I think 2019, and I had done this super long fasting experiment, 2 weeks of water fasting, and then fat fasting on top of that, where I was only consuming pure fat. And it was a self experiment, which I had done a ton of before. And I had done long fasts before that when I was at a higher weight. And my logic through this is visually, I clearly have a lot of fat, so I should be able to comfortably fast for this long. But it went weird. Even by the end of the first week, I was already talking to Dave and I was like, I don't know if I want to continue this. Like, I just keep thinking about food. And on previous fasts, wouldn't think about food at all. The main problem was that it was boring. And this was different. I was starting to get fatigued. I was starting to sleep a lot, but it was very disrupted. I'd have trouble sleeping at night, but then I'd have to take a nap during the day because I was so exhausted. My menstrual cycle got disrupted during that. I was feeling cold and just the obsessive thoughts about food. And it was weird, but what ultimately happened is I had posted a before picture before the fast and then a during picture, and 3 different women reached out to me privately and said something along the lines of, have you ever looked into lipedema? Because the pictures you've posted, it looks like it might be that. It's like, I don't know what lipedema is. I've never heard of it, so I don't know. And for me, like, I wasn't offended or anything. It's just like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know what that means. So I ended up looking further into it, and I talked to my doctor about it. And at the time, he was like, well, I don't know how much a diagnosis would help. There's not really much you can do about it. Like, I don't want to hear it. Just like, I need to know. I need to know for sure if this is what I'm dealing with. And so he referred me to a specialist. I took a big, awesome road trip with a couple of friends from Colorado to California. Beautiful, gorgeous scenery. Like, just the trip itself was really cool. And I got the diagnosis, and it's like, okay. And it actually took a while for it to set in, because at that point, it's just like, even when it was suggested to me, I was in research mode. And I was like, okay, like, what is this? What are all the papers published about it? What am I walking into, basically? And even at the diagnosis appointment, I was talking to the doctor, and I was like, okay, so like, there's this and blah blah blah, and do you think it works like this? Do you think this is happening? And what's funny is she has papers published on lipedema, and so I walked into the appointment. I was like, read all your papers, love your work. She's like, great. um, but it actually took a while for it to sink in. Like, after the diagnosis, I reached out to, I think it was an accumulation of multiple things. So Amber O'Hearn connected me with Leslyn Keith and Catherine Seo through the Lipedema Project. And I also reached out to them independently because they had written a paper talking about ketogenic diets for lipedema. And I was like, cool, already doing that. But I had some questions about some things that I recommended because I thought they were smart, um, in terms of like avoiding dairy and avoiding nut flours. And I had already seen in the keto and weight loss community that those could be problematic. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. Um, and so I reached out to them, connected with them. And that's a whole like explosion of things in itself. But it was probably about a year later where it really sunk in, like, oh, I have lipedema and this actually sucks really bad. um, like, at that point, I got pretty comfortable with knowing what it is and knowing what we know and some of what we don't know. And I learned a lot more about what we don't know over time. But there is a very emotional and psychological aspect to it, because before the lipedema diagnosis, I had done another experiment, two experiments back to back, actually. I had done a high fat carnivore experiment where I achieved my lowest weight ever. I looked so small, like, not normal necessarily. Like, I still looked disproportionate and stuff like that, but definitely smallest waist size I'd ever had. And then immediately after that, I did a high carb experiment. So in between, I had a washout where I ate high protein carnivore to regain the weight I had lost from high fat carnivore. And then I went into this high carb experiment. And I had put it together in a way that I thought would be more careful, because I was trying to replicate an experiment that Dave had done where he had done white bread and lean meat, like deli meat. I was like, I'm not doing that. Like, I have to be considerate of my mental health. And so I did mine with black beans and chicken breast and some spices in terms of like cumin and garlic powder. And for the last, I think, 5 days, I added in honey and bananas. So like these like wholesome foods, like trying to construct the best version of this that I could. And it still sucked. Like, over that experiment, which was 8 days long, plus in the weeks after, I gained a lot of weight. I think I gained like 20 pounds overall if you compare from the end of the high fat carnivore up until um, the final like measurement of the high carb experiment. And I detail it that way because the psychological impact of going to my smallest size ever to 20 pounds higher in the space of a few weeks was really not fantastic. But even more than that, I experienced a lot of fatigue during that experiment. And what was even worse is that at the end of each day, so there was a portion where it was same amount of calories, like 1,700 calories or something like that. And then it went up to 3,000 calories of extremely high carb, low fat. Um, at the end of the day, eating 3,000 calories, double what I was usually eating at that point, I was ravenously hungry. So uncontrollably hungry. I would be in bed at night, just like, I'm so hungry. It was miserable. And then in the 2 months after that, I started experiencing mood instability and anxiety, social anxiety. I went to 2 conferences immediately after that. I had to step out for some of them to just randomly cry for no reason whatsoever. And the weirdest experience that I had was I gave a presentation at Keto Fest again, and I was talking about the links between insulin resistance and the immune system and how those interact and work with each other and interfere with each other and all this stuff. And now it's one of my favorite presentations that I've ever given. And after I gave the presentation, people were coming up and saying how they appreciate it and how they found it really interesting and it's such an important topic and yada, yada, yada. And as they were saying that, in my head, I was like, they're lying to you. They are telling you lies. They are making it up. They're being polite. They hated it. They didn't get it. They didn't understand it. You did all that work for nothing. Like just this stream. And even as that stream is coming in, I'm like, this does not make sense. Like this reaction is completely separated from reality. And the most infuriating thing about probably dealing with any mental illness, but at least in my experience, dealing with depression and anxiety is that like you can acknowledge that this makes no sense and you are out of your mind, but that just results in its own spiral of, yeah, you just suck. You can't even talk your way out of this. You can't reason your way out of this. Like there's nothing, and it just becomes this whole other thing. So you can know that something is wrong, but you can't, like, it's just there.
Awful.
And so that went on for 2 months afterwards. And the other frustrating thing is I immediately went back to high fat carnivore after the high carb experiment, but I was still gaining weight. I was still extremely hungry. For the first time ever on my keto journey, I had carb cravings. I was craving like donuts of all things. I had to like sit because I would go out to this like Kroger basically and sit in the kind of dining area and work or knit or do whatever. And I would have to like struggle not to get up and go get a donut because I was having such strong cravings. And that had never happened to me before, ever. Like when I originally went keto, I was like, cool, I don't miss any of that stuff at all. I'm all good. I'm happy with what I got. And it was just like problem on top of problem on top of problem. And even eventually, once that settled, I couldn't get the weight back off. The amount of weight that I had gained was still there and it wasn't going anywhere. And it's like, what the heck? what did I do? So you take all of that, and eventually I did lose some of it, though not all of it. So I got my waist size back down to normal by cutting out dairy, which I had never had issues with previously, and got down a little bit, but I was still up in weight. And I did a DEXA scan. I had one prior to that experiment sometime before and then sometime after. And the areas where fat had gone up in my legs, in my arms, and as we'll discuss, those are areas where I have lipedema tissue. So fast forward to about a year after my lipedema diagnosis. And like, I was just thinking about it in terms of like something I consciously chose to do may have caused lipedema progression, and there may not be anything I can do, barring surgery, to ever get that back off. And I was crying. I was upset. Like, I was like, what did I do to myself? There's so much like blame that you can place on yourself with lipedema that is not appropriate at all. Like, I didn't know I had lipedema. If I had, I would not have done the experiment. And I will never do an experiment like that again because I know that does not fit with the disease that I have. It's not a good idea. It's not going to end well. But especially like being in a health-centered community, there can be judgment from other people in terms of how you look, and a lot of people don't know about lipedema, or from like social media randos, they'll tell me, I don't actually have lipedema, I'm just making excuses for being fat. So all of that. So you're dealing with this chronic condition, and then you also get comments from people just laying blame, and then you can also blame yourself for, increase in symptoms or going slightly off of diet, like adding dairy back in and gaining weight from that, and like all of this other stuff on top of trying to do all these things to manage. So it's complicated and very frustrating to deal with. But at the same time, my research brain is like, this is so interesting. Like, this is so fascinating. This is such a puzzle to work with and unlock. And like, it's so weird. Lipedema is so weird. And it makes it like, I'll fluctuate. I'll have moments where I'm like really upset and angry that I have to deal with this. And then I'll be like, okay, well, what are you going to do about it then? And then my research brain is like, well, what can we do about it? That's such a great question. Let's think about this for a little while. And yeah, I will say that I've seen a lot of improvement after the diagnosis and working with a lymphatic therapist and just all this different stuff. I've definitely seen improvement, reductions in swelling. I haven't had any random bruises in about a year and a half at this point. So things have gotten better, and I'm really happy about that. And at the same time, it's not a thing where it's like, okay, you get diagnosed. Okay, here you go. All right, you look normal, feel normal, you're fine. Like, it's a stark contrast to anything I've ever dealt with before. And I also realized that people listening to this may be very confused because, like I said, a lot of people don't know what lipedema is. So briefly, lipedema is a fat and lymphatic disorder. So it impacts how you move fluid out of the tissue. So there can be swelling. You can have worsened swelling over the day with things like heat, which in Colorado right now is suffocating. And then also orthostatic edema. So as you're on your feet for longer, you can start having swelling in your lower limbs. It's also not uncommon for people to note in the lipedema community, they may have increased swelling with eating a high carb diet for some people. That's certainly the case for me. With certain food triggers or food sensitivities, dairy is not uncommon, nuts not uncommon. Nightshade sometimes, kind of like if you read Georgia Eads' book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, she has a whole subsection on things that may interfere, same kind of stuff that we see in the lipedema community. So that book is great if you're looking for an intro into like, what do I even need to be looking out for? And then also there can be pain. So luckily there are things that you can do about it. So ketogenic diets, over and over and over again, we have study after study showing pain reduction with ketogenic diets, which is great. We did a mini experiment through the Lipedema Project and Lipedema Simplified, trying out exogenous ketones that also worked to reduce pain in almost all of the participants. And then compression and lymphatic therapies have been shown to help reduce pain. So there are things you can do about it, is the good thing. But I remember growing up, people would just gently touch my arm to like get my attention, and I'd be yanking my arm away. There was one point I got a tick on me and mom was trying to like burn it off. And I was just like, oh my God, that hurts. And she's like, it cannot hurt that much because it shouldn't. It should not hurt that much. But that is an aspect of lipedema, is the highly sensitive nature. So even just being sensitive to little touches or just flat out pain, especially for some people with pressure. So pressing on the fat can be quite painful. There can also be like this lactic acid like muscle burn with minor repetitive movement in areas where people have lipedema. There's like all sorts of different wide, diverse range of different aches and pains that can come with it. So I'm very lucky that I got on a ketogenic diet. So a lot of that pain actually went away. I have a little bit of tenderness close to the muscle in my arms, but my arms are special babies and they don't really respond to very much in terms of like lymphatic treatments and stuff like that. They're the most stubborn, they're also the area with the most lipedema tissue on me. And then the visual aspect that I briefly touched on, the disproportionate accumulation of fat. So the kind of pictures you'll see of lipedema might be someone with a very, very itty bitty waist, but then if you look at their lower body, it's like an entirely different person. Or like what I noticed, the disproportion in the arms. In some people, there's also arm involvement. So the torso might be like they might have a healthy waist size, but then if you just looked at their arms, it's like, oh, that person is obese because the accumulation of fat is location specific. And if you look at people with lipedema, there's a huge wide range. So they could just have it from they could just have lipedema tissue in their hips, or they could have it from hip to ankle, or they could also have it from shoulder to wrist. And in those cases, maybe it's worse in the upper arms compared to the lower arms. They could have it just from their hip down to their knee. There's different types. So different people with lipedema are going to look different. But the fat texture is also different in those areas. So that's kind of how we're quantifying it. Not just in terms of where the fat is accumulating, but also the differences in that tissue too. So there may be, non-pitting edema, so they're swelling, but when you press into it, it does refill, which is different than, say, like extremely severe heat-induced edema, where it may start pitting, you press into it, and it doesn't refill, so it leaves this dent. Or with lymphedema, which could also be happening in the person to complicate matters, where they'll have that same pitting edema. And so there's that part of the texture where it feels like kind of spongy, or it might feel overly loose and stretchy in terms of the fat tissue itself. It might hang, so it might have a lot more laxity, so it hangs off of the limb or off of the thigh, very loose and thin. One thing I haven't really seen in many other disorders is the nodules that are in the fat tissue of people with lipedema. So the nodules, if we look at in the case definition, or not case definition, the standard of care paper for lipedema in the US, they have pictures of it, if you don't mind pictures of things that are supposed to be on the inside of people being on the outside. They have pictures of these nodules, and what it is it's scar tissue that is wrapping around chunks of the fat tissue. So you have more fibrous bits of just fibrotic material, so basically buildup of connective tissue. That's all throughout the lipedema tissue, but then you also have these nodules of hard chunks of scar tissue in there. And if you feel the fat of someone with lipedema, you can often feel these nodules. It might feel like grains of rice, or more like larger clumps, like plum-sized or walnut-sized, all the way up to apple-sized. Like they can get quite large. And in some cases, the skin, especially around, like you can have overhanging portions of fat, and down at the bottom of that, it might be very stiff and hard because it's become so fibrotic. So clearly there are weird things going on with the fat. And that's probably, in my opinion, also part of why it's so difficult to lose. Like scar tissue is built to be stable. And there are situations where it could change. I mean, there are entire physical therapy aspects of trying to manipulate scar tissue and soften it and all that stuff. But with lipedema, it's in such a strange area. It's not around a joint where you could stretch it and kind of manipulate it. It's in these little solid chunks in the fat tissue, which makes it very difficult to deal with. And then when you're trying to lose weight, if you're thinking about just the physical aspect of that, like not only do you have this fluid accumulation and the swelling in the legs, which in itself, they've shown in mice that fluid stasis in the tissue can induce fat tissue growth. So there's that aspect, which may be inhibiting. Wow. And then you also have the scar tissue and this fibrosis, which might also be impeding weight loss and fat loss specifically. So you could starve yourself for 2 weeks, like I did with the fasting, and you may lose a couple inches off of your waist, but then when I looked at my arm measurements from beginning to end of that experiment, my arm measurement, despite being very large, like disproportionately large, only went down, I think, by something like a quarter of an inch. So if you look at that, like I disproportionately lost fat when I was trying to lose weight. So more came off from my waist than it did in my arms and my legs. So that's another aspect of people with lipedema, understandably may try to lose weight through calorie restriction or exercise or whatever it is. And they may find that even if they're successful with that, like let's say they are a little bit, have a little bit of abdominal obesity, so their waist size is a little bit bigger, so maybe they have a little bit of fat to lose there. They may lose fat in their torso and their neck and their face, but then they're like, what the heck is happening? Like my thighs are big and I cannot get them down no matter what I do. So there's the disproportionate fat, there's the disproportionate loss when they try to lose weight, the resistance to calorie restriction and exercise, there's the pain, the nodules, the other skin and tissue changes, like I mentioned. In some people, depending on where they have lipedema tissue, they may also have something called cuffing. Basically, this is because they have this not typical accumulation of fat, in some cases all the way down to the ankle, like I mentioned, and then it abruptly stops. So unless something else is happening, like lymphedema, typically the feet and hands aren't impacted. So you may have fat accumulation all the way down to your wrist or ankle, but then your feet look as skinny as anybody else's.
Wow.
Like I can see the veins in my feet. They're like not any unusual fat accumulation in there. And so you have this almost like little sleeve that ends at the ankle or the wrist. And so that's another thing. I'll be walking around town and I'll just be looking at people's ankles. Just like, oh yeah, there's one. And yeah, I think so. The other aspect that's kind of important is that lipedema impacts almost exclusively women. So I do know of a clinician who's worked with males who have lipedema, and there are a couple of case reports on men with lipedema as well. But it's rare, like their case reports, because it's unusual. The vast majority of lipedema patients are female. And another aspect that goes with that is a lot of people notice that the symptoms in terms of the swelling and the fat gain and the disproportion and all of that tends to be triggered or worsened by periods of hormonal flux. So puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. There's a lot of women who noticed it starting when they were young and they started menstruating, and then all of a sudden they see all of this stuff going on. Or there are a lot of women who are diagnosed after pregnancy. They start noticing that their legs are swelling and it's not going down, and they're gaining weight uncontrollably and they don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden their legs are painful and sensitive. And it's like, what is happening? And then there are also some women who, as they're going through perimenopause, they start seeing symptoms or their symptoms start getting worse. So probably something hormonal going on. But lipedema is relatively young. It was only diagnosed and named in the 1940s. And if you compare that to like diabetes or cardiovascular disease, we have notes on them from ancient Egypt. So we know a lot more about them than we do with lipedema. But the cool thing is that over the past 5 years, there's just been this explosion in research, this explosion in interest. We had the World Lipedema Congress, we have the case definition published, we have the US standard of care published, German guidelines published, all of this different stuff going on. There's more recognition in terms of it being included in the category of lymphatic disorders, more information on there being lymphatic abnormalities in lipedema, even early stage. So we're learning a lot about it, and it's just complex. Like it impacts a bunch of different parts of the body, not only in terms of location, but we're talking about fat tissue. We're also talking about swelling. We're talking about fibrosis and scar tissue. We're talking about pain. Where is the pain coming from? Why is there pain? Why in some patients is there not pain? So there's all of this different complexity. And then you have all that complexity, and then you have patients who aren't getting diagnosed until their 50s or 60s. So they're just left completely unmanaged, no knowledge of what to do, or even that they have a disease. A lot of people talk about how they knew something was wrong, and they would talk to their doctor about it, and their doctor would just say, "You're fat. You're non-compliant. You're not actually dieting. You're eating more than you think you are. All this stuff. You're in pain because you're fat." All of this stuff. And so it just goes into this one pile of what lipedema patients have to deal with just day to day. And there's so much that can go into management in terms of a lot of people do manual lymph drainage. So they're helping move that fluid out of the body to help reduce that tightness and heaviness in the limbs, to help get the lymphatics, just give them some assistance. The pain reduction, like I said, the bruising reduction, all this stuff. They may be doing things to break up the fibrotic tissue and kind of help restore some of that health. They may be doing ketogenic diets, and that in itself, for some people, can be a whole thing because of how complicated diets can be and the difficulty they can run into in terms of cravings or navigating with family or at work or during travel, all this different stuff. Food sensitivities they have to figure out, all of it. And then also they may need to wear compression every day. They may need to do aquatic exercises to help the lymphatics as well through the pressure of the water. They may need to do physical therapy if they have mobility issues. They may need to, if all of that is doing its job, they may be regaining mobility, in which case some of them have had to relearn how to walk because they've been immobile for years. There's the mental and psychological aspect. They may be going through therapy. They may be going through body peace or body acceptance, or dealing with the fact that they have this disease and that it does impact how they look, and that impacts their self-esteem. It impacts dating. It impacts marriages and intimacy. It just all of this stuff. Not to mention any number of other health issues that they might be dealing with. Hypothyroidism is common. They may have hypermobility. So many things. But like I mentioned, there's been a lot of work going into lipedema, and part of that is building this support system. So through Lipedema Simplified, we have free webinars to talk about education. When this comes out, we'll have done one on food addiction with Nader Ali. We always have free webinars going on because just having some entry-level access is so important. We have the Tribe community, which is a paid membership where people can get more access to knowledge, but then also we have a craft club, so we can not think about lipedema for a couple hours once a month. We have book clubs. We have all this different stuff. And then we also have the free community in terms of like the Facebook groups and the meetups that we're doing all through June as part of Lipedema Awareness Month. And lots of great, amazing people. Like the lipedema community is full of so many curious and inquisitive and smart and intelligent and hardworking and hopeful women. And I love working with them, and I love being part of the community. And there's just so much that comes from having a community. Like we've seen the same thing with the keto community and with the weight loss community. Like there are studies showing if you're part of a community that helps support your goals and helps keep you on track and motivates you and supports you when you need it and understands what you're going through, it makes whatever you're dealing with so much easier. Well, not necessarily easier, but it helps lift the difficulty through many hands instead of just yours. Yeah. And it helps keep you on track when things go wrong. And sometimes it's just nice to be able to go into a private Facebook group and say, I'm dealing with this. And like even something silly, like I'm trying to buy pants. And when I buy to fit my thighs or my hips, the waist is like 4 or 5 inches too big. But then if I buy for my waist, there's no way that's going to fit. No way that's going to work. Like it's such, like I don't have tailoring abilities to make these fit by disproportionate body. And then instead of people going, well, what are you talking about? Like, what's going on there? Start asking questions. What's lipedema? What, huh? You just have people who say, oh my God, I know exactly what you mean. That's so annoying. We're here for you. So the community aspect is such a big part of it. And people come and they go as they need it. Sometimes they're doing really well and they won't check in for a while and then they'll come back and be like, I'm doing great, or I hit a rough spot, I need the support again. So it's really cool to see people entering in and getting the support and the education and the resources in terms of how to find a lymphatic therapist, what doctors know about this. I'm considering surgery because XYZ reason. Maybe it's pain, maybe it's mobility, maybe it's just the fact that the disorder is disfiguring and they want to address that aspect. What surgeons are trustworthy? What surgeons actually know about lipedema? What surgeons know about the techniques needed to deal with it? Or, like, I'm considering a weight loss drug. What other experiences have you guys had? Did it help with lipedema symptoms? Did it not? Did it come back later? All this, there's a ton of different questions. And having people who are dealing with the same thing that you are, who can chime in and say, well, here's my experience. Of course, different people are going to experience different things. People will say, oh, that helped me. Other people say, no, that didn't help me. But if you can get at least a general idea, it can be helpful in terms of prioritizing. That's part of why we did the exogenous ketone experiment, taking the ketone drink, is because we had seen people in the community doing it, but it was stories here and there of individuals of, yeah, I tried that, or yeah, I find that helpful. And other people say, no, I tried that, it wasn't helpful. And so we did this group experiment as a community to see, like, okay, if we take a group of people and they're all taking exogenous ketones, they all have lipedema, we know how many people have pain before we start and then after, like, what happens? And now, at the very least, if somebody asks, like, should I try exogenous ketones? It's like, well, it's not a study, it's not a randomized control trial, but we did this group experiment and here's what we found. It's like, oh, maybe I do want to try that if pain is my biggest issue right now. And I don't have time to try a ketogenic diet, or I'm getting into trying a ketogenic diet, but it takes time to implement.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
it's
Talked
such
for a long time.
it's just such an amazing story, and it's so frustrating. And I've always wondered, you're always so stoic and you're always so scientific, but there is an emotional side to all of this. And so I really appreciate you being so authentic and open about all of this and providing that for other women who are struggling with this, because yeah, like we mentioned earlier, like I think it's so much more pervasive than anybody knows. And to get that information out there in multiple different ways, like you said, it's going to connect with people in different ways. And so I love what you're doing. And I love, again, that you've been able to be so open and authentic about it. Just so utterly frustrating to deal with, I'm sure, but like that you've seen improvements, that you've been able to be in this space and share this information is absolutely wonderful. So we'll be sure to link all the information that we can about that. We just hosted Dave on the show not too long ago, and I didn't feel like I gave him enough time to talk about Own Your Labs. Can you tell us a little about your work with Own Your Labs?
Yeah, so Own Your Labs is a company that Dave and I started, and it's kind of what supports at least me to be able to do the research that I do with the Lipedema Project and publishing papers both with Dave and with the Lipedema community, and to be able to put enough time and effort into looking into lipedema, or lipidology when I was more focused on that, insulin resistance when I was more focused on that, because like Dave and I had discussed it. It's like we wanted something that we could do that we could feel really happy about. So we didn't necessarily want to be selling a product because that can get really complicated really fast. But we were both doing a lot of blood testing because we were doing these self experiments, and other people were asking, like, how do I do that? I want to do that. Like, my doctor won't order those things, especially if I want to test cholesterol 3 times in the same week. They're going to raise an eyebrow at that. And it's not really necessarily appropriate in that case. It's more just playing around and experimenting and looking into this kind of stuff. And sometimes people would have difficulty just getting an insulin test because their doctor didn't know about the test, didn't know how to interpret it, maybe didn't know what to do if it came back high. So then there's liability questions of, if I order this and it's high and then something happens, it gets very sticky and tricky. And so Own Your Labs kind of came out of that. And essentially what it is it's just a lab ordering service. So we go through LabCorp for the majority of our testing. And you just place an order, you get a lab order form, you take it to LabCorp, they do the blood draw and testing, and then you've got your results and they're yours. You can do whatever you take with them. You can do whatever you want with them, rather. And a lot of people take them to their doctor for interpretation and say, hey, I got this. Can you help me go through it? Or their health coach or whatever it is. And some people are just checking things out of curiosity, or doing self-experiments. We do have citizen science customers for sure. So yeah, it's been really cool. And yeah, it's been nice to have a job that I can feel like I'm providing a service to the community that has helped us out so much. Because with Own Your Labs, the way that we grow is through word of mouth. So people try us out and they like the experience. They like how easy it is. Everything's available a la carte. They can order what they want, don't order what they don't want. We're supportive of the citizen science community, being weirdos ourselves, I'll say. And yeah, we have a great community, and people in the community have been supportive of us too, just by talking about us. And yeah, so it's been very cool.
That's lovely. Yeah, anything that can democratize anything in the healthcare space is so important to be able to get this message out and get people more information, because we're up against a lot. And so I'm really glad you got involved with that and you're doing that with Dave. It's just so fitting that you guys would be doing that work. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I really hope this is not the last time we chat on this show. We hope you can come back some other time and we can talk about insulin resistance or whatever else that you're fascinated by. I know you will be fascinated by something and taking on way too much work. That's par for the course for you, Siobhan. But as for now, where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Yeah, so through the Lipedema Project and Lipedema Simplified, I'm the research specialist with the Lipedema Project. So you can find me there. I'll often co-host webinars or some of the events that we do, like the upcoming event in September that we're going to be doing. We'll be focusing a lot on the holistic approach for lipedema. So all of those different aspects that I mentioned in terms of nutrition and compression and MLD and the psychological and the social and the community support, all of that different stuff we're going to be going over and kind of giving an entryway into that. We'll have experts speaking on each topic, including our own experts there as well. So you can find me over at the Lipedema Project and Lipedema Simplified, at the Facebooks associated with them. I'm also very active in the tribe community. I'm a tribe member myself. So you'll often find me at our arts and crafts group or some of the book clubs. We did a book club on Georgia Eats book in April, which was good timing for us. So lots of that going on. And then also in terms of social media, I'm on Facebook, but mostly just in the Facebook groups. And then I'm very active on Twitter, or X if you would prefer. But yeah, very active there right now. Over the next few months, I'm working on an article series that I'm posting to X Twitter. And it's going through all of the different characteristics of lipedema that we outline in our case definition paper. So I definitely highly recommend you read the paper, but I'm considering this a supplement to that. So I'm kind of going through some of my own thoughts. I have the intro post out now. As of recording, I'm working on the talking about the kind of sex dominance, like the females being more affected, some components into why that might be, what we can learn from the male case reports, and then I'll continue going down the line. It'll probably take a while because we have 10 different characteristics that we talk about in the paper, and I want to go through each individually because they're all super interesting, and there's tons of different things we can learn about from each of them.
Wow. That's it? That's all you're doing?
Well, we are working on some other things. You can also find me at Own Your Labs. So if you call in to Own Your Labs, if you need some help with something, it will sometimes be me or our other customer service person answering. You're always going to get a person, so you can find me there. Yeah, and I'm working on a bunch of other stuff.
Of course you are.
Yeah, I'll discuss those a little bit later.
Siobhan, that's amazing. You always have so many irons in the fire for sure. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. I feel even more privileged that we were able to have this time with you, for how incredibly busy you are. For you to take some time out of your day and your life to come on our show today is just so awesome. I really love and respect you, and really appreciate your time and to come on our show today. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. It's no point being obsessive about something if I can't talk about it with other people and subject them to just a torrent of all my thoughts and ideas. And oh, did you know about this? It's so interesting.
You definitely will always have an audience here that will be equally, or try to be equally, obsessed as you in some of these topics. And it's so important to get this message out. So thank you again so very much for being on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks again.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio. Thank you so very much for listening to and supporting Boundless Body Radio. This podcast is such a passion of mine, one of my favorite parts about running our business, and none of this would be possible without our incredible guests and listeners like yourself. Thank you so very much for all of the amazing reviews that we get on Apple and Spotify. Trust me, we read them all, and it means the world to hear that you are enjoying the show as well. I am very excited to announce that this summer I will be hosting a nutrition seminar series. This is actually a project that I started after I became certified as a nutrition coach. I wanted to get a group of people together to discuss all aspects of human nutrition, and as a bonus, I did the whole thing outside by a pool, which was great. After the pandemic, I stopped hosting the series, but this year I've decided to bring it back. Each week we'll have a particular topic and an agenda. We'll have outlines that include references, and also meal plans, guest appearances, book giveaways, and more, all for free. For those of you who live in the Salt Lake City area, the seminars will be hosted every Tuesday at noon, starting on May 28th, and will run all the way until September 3rd. The seminar will be hosted outside, of course, at the beautiful Bowery Park in Daybreak, where I live. If you're available and in the area, we would absolutely love to see you there. If you are unable to attend, either that day and time does not work for you, or you don't live in the area, good news for you as well, we are going to put all the recordings and post them on YouTube, where you can submit listener questions in the comment section, which we can address in future seminars. I'm also including all of the seminar materials on our website, so you don't have to miss out on the content. My goal is to make a comprehensive yet simple understanding of nutrition so that anybody confused about how they should eat can create a framework for themselves based on their individual goals. As I said, if you're interested in participating, we'd love to have you. If you can't make it into the in-person seminar, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also our website at myboundlessbody.com/seminar to find all of the resources, videos, and a fun quiz. Either way, thank you as always for listening to Boundless Body Radio.